Welcome to the Gamigo Cosplay Contest. I am Lou, Fiesta Online lover, cosplay newbie, and soon-to-be sexy archer. Can you already spot the resemblance? I can, and I'm really excited on how everything is coming together. This is my 5th week on this project, and in this video I'll be showing you how I got this from this. Now, the most important thing when working with EVA foam is, well, the foam, but the second most important thing is the glue. When starting this project, I still had a nearly full tube of 50 gram of contact cement at home, and when that was empty, I bought another tube of 50 gram, thinking that would be sufficient. Of course it wasn't, and the tubes are not exactly cheap. So this time, glueless again, I decided to go big and cheap. Because by now I'm assuming this won't be my last EVA foam project. So I bought a big can of contact cement. A transparent version this time, which contains 650 gram and cost as much as my 2 tubes combined. This I refilled into smaller plastic squeeze bottles. Sadly, I can't really recommend this particular glue. It's a lot more difficult to work with than the classic version. It took me 3 attempts to glue together my second wrist bracer, and even then I was left with these very gaping seams, requiring a 4th working step to close them up. But well, looks like I'm stuck with it for a while. At least any excess glue is very easy to remove. My new glue all bottled up, I finished my boot covers, attaching the new details before using foam clay to cover up the ugly seams. Last but not least, I dremeled the details to a finish. But now that the Dremel was already in use, I had no more excuses. I beveled the edges of more feathers, and when I was done, the next bunch was already waiting in the wings. When I started this project, I completely underestimated the amount of work I'd have to put in for the feathers, and I'll think twice about ever making another one once this armor's done. Luckily, I finally found a solution on how to recreate the quills, cable ties, which I hope will look realistic enough once they're all painted up. I used my mum's sewing machine to speed up the process of making my second glove, and after that I turned this into this, into this. I simply love it. The material I used was Warbler's finest art, and as this was my first time working with this material, there are some annotations I'd like to make. Firstly, Warbler is a lot more difficult to cut than I expected. My cheap paper scissors didn't like it at all. Next, the edges of the material can be quite sharp after cutting. I suppose this is not so much a problem on bigger pieces where you can heat up all the edges and use your fingers or some tools to mold them, but with the small details on the fingers, this wasn't really possible. Not when every time I heated them up I destroyed the shape. I'm hoping that priming will help with this problem. Otherwise, putting on the rings will rip my gloves to shreds in the long run. This week, I also tried to find a way to attach all of the bracers. My first idea was using a leather strap paired with Velcro, but that didn't really work, mostly because the bracers are too voluminous instead of form-fitting, and also the leather straps would be too visible, and they'd never give enough stability to hold up the shoulder pads. So I scrapped the idea and tried magnets next, which I sewed into thick elastic bands, while gluing 2 1-cent pieces into my wrist bracer. The strip of silver faux leather was supposed to protect my money from ripping out of the foam when trying to remove the bracers. I assembled everything, and then I learned a lesson about anatomy. In the original armor, the bracers fly, and to recreate that look, I intended to attach them to my upper arm. But obviously, the upper arm doesn't turn with the wrist, so attaching the bracer there looked very weird once I moved my hand. So instead, I had to attach them closer to my wrist. Also, the stability of the magnets was not to my liking, so I switched to putting magnets on both sides. I made the changes to my elastic band and also added some EVA foam layers to create the flying optic. The final result is not too shabby. Just kidding. I love it. Now, let's just hope I'm good enough at painting to not ruin everything. Next came the upper arm bracers. I had decided to add a layer of Warbler to create more stability, which I did. It worked like a charm. After the Warbler, I added another layer of 5mm EVA foam. Finding the places for the magnets was a little tricky. The first upper arm bracer I made got a 2-magnet design, while the second got 3 magnets. This was not due to some planning on my part, but because the last elastic I sewed had enough excess material left over to make a 3-magnet design possible. When gluing everything together, I had to be careful to make sure the magnets were facing in the right direction. Then I had to do some cleanup, which later I'm going to have to cover up with some EVA foam. Lastly, I made a fitting test. The 3 magnets are quite firm, while the piece with only 2 might cause problems once the flying shoulder pads are attached. I also used EVA foam to make the small turquoise crystals for the ears. A triplet of triangle rulers helped me recreate the shape. Lastly, I finished the necklace. And if everything else turns out ugly or unfunctional, at least this little piece of jewelry will have been worth it. I thought I'd give a quick walkthrough on how I made it, because it was a little trickier than expected, and also it's far too beautiful to only dedicate one sentence to it. The centerpieces of the design are 4mm rhinestones made for sewing. They come with 4 holes drilled into the metal casing on the bottom, as well as 4 metal fingers on top bent into place to hold the stone. These fingers create 4 loops, which can also be used for threading. To recreate the look, start by threading the desired number of rhinestones together using the bottom holes. Then, turn them around, split the 2 ends of the thread, and pull one each through 2 of the loops on either side of the first rhinestone. At this step, it is important to make sure the thread lies beneath the edge of the rhinestone so the stone can hold it in place. Otherwise, it will simply slide out of the loops once you try to pull it taut. Continue the design by adding a pair of beads in a desired color and repeat the looping and beading until the end of the line. Then, cautiously, pull the thread taut, taking care that none of the threads jump out from beneath the rhinestones. It helps to have a needle at hand to push the threads back into their place. To tie up the threads, simply turn the rhinestones back around and use the holes to tie a knot. And that's all the magic. It's advisable to use a nylon thread. This is the one I used. Because nylon is less flexible than real thread, it doesn't jump out of the loops quite as easily during assembly. And that's it for this week. I hope you got some new ideas on how to do things and how not to do things. And all that's left to say is stay creative and see you next week.